Hello and welcome. I'm Abbie. This is Stories Lived, Stories Told, and here's my question for today. What does it look like to embrace improv principles in our life and communication? We've talked about improv before, very early on in this podcast, in our conversation with Rick Spann, and it's something we're returning to today with our next conversation partner. Today we're beginning part one of a conversation with Don Waisanen, a professor of strategic and leadership communication who also has a passion for improv. Don has some really great insight to share today, and I'm so glad to be able to share this conversation with you. A lot of Don's work is about centering communication, regardless of the work being done, and I'd like to invite you to consider what your work, your relationships, your life could look like if you also centered communication, if you really took a communication perspective. The way that Don centers communication is through some principles of improv that he has learned in his experience and has been able to apply. And so we're going to learn about that today, talking about what Don's idea of a better social world is. So let's begin with Don. Hi, Don. Thanks for joining me for this conversation today.
Hi, Abbie. Thanks so much for having me. Very excited to talk to you today.
I am very excited, although we've only known each other a short time after a couple meetings in the past 2 months. I'll share that immediately upon talking to you. I thought this is a person with some insight that I would like to have and that I imagine you to be a good conversation partner. And so I'm really looking forward to where this conversation is going to go today and what I can learn from you and what kind of new ideas we can generate together.
The feeling is mutual. I think the last time we talked, we said, hey, we could just keep talking probably forever. So we'll keep it honed today. But
right.
Yeah, that feeling was mutual.
I appreciate that. Well, to get started, I would love for you to introduce yourself. Maybe you could share some stories about yourself and maybe thinking about the conversation we're about to get into. You could pick and choose some stories that feel like good context to have.
Sure. So I'll go back to after graduating from college, I went out in the working world and had some stints in broadcast media, worked in politics for a while, mostly at the local level, and also had always had an interest in the performing arts. And all these streams were very disparate. And I was working at one point for a PR firm just briefly and working on political campaigns and at a labor union, even at one point, just some really different experiences. And I kept searching for the common thread. And the thread I found was communication and not just communication as, let's throw in communication to the working world and stir and see what happens, right? Which is a lot of approaches, but really seeing communication at the center of all of this as the driver of value and creating meaning. And so I just felt like every problem I was seeing in public affairs in particular, most of the areas I was working in had to do with the public sector in some way. What does it mean to work in the public interest for the public good, not just private interests? Most of the challenges and problems I saw all stemmed from communication. It was about I saw that things that I thought were very highfalutin, for instance, like international relations, I got really interested in at one point. I came to realize, international relations is just conversations between two people at the end of the day, or two or more people.
Right.
And however, the quality of those conversations determines the kind of policies we see and the laws and regulations that develop. So maybe I need to back up and go look at communication itself. And so I was really charged to do that. And I felt like this was an umbrella that would really help me situate all of my interests in the same place. I could look at media, I could look at politics, I could, a bit of a, to use the cliched metaphor, a kid in a candy store. I liked it all. I wanted to So I went eventually back to grad school, went to University of Southern California, their PhD program in communication. And I sometimes tell students too that I remember back in undergrad, I was a political science major, and I thought communication was really obvious. I communicate, you communicate, we all communicate. That's really all there is to this. And then I took a communication class and I went, this is not as obvious as I thought. this is deeper and broader and there's a lot more to it. And then I took another one and I took another one, ended up double majoring in communication. And I feel like through my work experiences, especially early work experiences, that never went away. And I just went, okay, PhD is right for me. I want to understand everything I can about this really pervasive and consequential subject matter, which affects everything in our world. Always has, always will. And again, just moving communication from the periphery to the center of our understandings has really been a mission for me. So yeah, I'm interested in the quality of conversations people have, the types of stories we tell. Storytelling has been a really big theme throughout my work. I did a dissertation on how a lot of public policies we've seen in the US in recent decades stemmed from particular stories and the dominance of those stories and how those stories made other stories become submerged in different contexts for different people. So storytelling has fascinated me. I think there's a good and a bad side of storytelling too, right? Are we telling single stories? Are we telling multiple stories? And along the way with all of this, I started teaching undergrads at California Lutheran University back in 2007 or so, and had to teach a class in communication theory. And along the way, and I think there's many people out there for whom this was a similar experience, ran into a chapter on CMM and went, wow, I'm in grad school right now, but this seems like the best thing, the most interesting, the most encompassing set of concepts and theories, frameworks, ideas, processes, tools. I think we could use many different names for these. About communication. I got excited. So I thought, you know what, when I get a chance, which wasn't until after I finished school, I'm going to go through everything I can on this CMM stuff, starting with Barnett's work, Making Social Worlds, and the previous communication books with Vern Cronin and others, and just started integrating it into teaching and research. And how much more do you want me to go?
No, that's great. That's a really great start. I'm certain that more stories will emerge over the rest of our conversation. Sure. So if there's anything else you feel like is important up front, feel free to add on. But
yeah, I think the only other thing I should just mention here is that along the way, my side life for 20 years had been in the field of improvisational theater. I grew up watching the British version of Whose Line Is It Anyway, which is this improvised comedy show. It came to the US at a certain point and loved that show. I just remember being 7 years old, watching that show and being amazed at the joy the actors exhibited toward each other, the quickness, the ability to really build on each other's lines and not negate each other. And if I had to sum it up, it seemed like they were practicing these superhuman communication skills with each other on stage that you don't often see in everyday life. And so for me, that was a really early marker that there was a world there, some kind of social world there among many other worlds out there that was special, distinctive. There was something to it that was worth going with further. So for about 20 years, going all the way back to college, my side life has been in improv theater. I love improv comedy, performance, and been doing that. Whose Line Is It Anyway type of shows, things like that, as well as what's called long form, which is more like get up on stage and make up a play with 6 people. Things like that, right? There's groups out there right now that will improvise an entire new Jane Austen play on the spot from one audience suggestion. There's improvised Shakespeare, things like that. So that eventually merged with all of this and CMM for me. And then I went, wow, I've been doing this as kind of a side life for a really long time for fun. Some people play golf. I do improv.
Right.
But then I started bringing more of it into the classroom, doing little improv games and exercises, and students were really responsive to it. That was fun. That was way better than a lecture on like. And I said, well, what I started doing was saying, we're not going to lecture so much as I want you to experience the concepts first. You can have the actual experience, because who's the most persuasive person to any of us? It's ourselves. So better just to sort of see it, experience it, prove it to ourselves first through an exercise or a game. And then afterwards we'll debrief and we'll get into PowerPoint slides or whatever. And I found that order really hit in classes. Students loved it. They love getting out of their seats, especially to do something and walk around and build some energy with other people. So this all culminated in a project called Improv for Democracy that I developed, and it's really all grounded in CMM. And I start the book, it's SUNY Press, came out 3 years ago. I start this book with a reference to CMM and Barnett Pierce that has always really impacted me. And I've used this now as sort of the foundation for really all of my work with communication and leadership, especially. Barnett pointed out that the advances we see in other areas of life have been astronomical, right? In areas from medicine to technology, right? New healthcare initiatives, things like that. There's been these really exponential advances for humanity. Dentists, the state of dentistry. 2023 is amazing compared to 50 years ago, right? But our understandings and practices for communication as a subject have not kept pace with those developments. And so the project is to push our forms of communication, the types of communication we use that help people inhabit better social worlds and create a better public life, to help people use to find and put in motion those forms of communication that meet this day and age. And I loved that call from Pierce, and that's always been just the center for this. And I said, Improv for Democracy, using improv to train for communication, leadership, civic skills, for me, is just one path among many paths we might take to meet that call.
Yeah. Do you still perform improv?
I do, a little bit all over. The theaters in New York, a lot of them closed down during the pandemic. There's been a grand restructuring in some of those worlds. But yeah, I do. And improv communities are great because people come to it with such a yes and spirit, which is simply say the foundation of all improv. Yes, it's not agreement. It's affirming the reality that someone's offering you and trying to build on it first before going to critique or negation or anything like that. So the great thing is you can go to just about any city in the US, internationally, where there's improvisers, and people come to the experience with that spirit. Let's do a show. Let's do a pop-up thing. Let's do anything. And people usually just, let's do it. And you don't have to prepare. That's the best part. I have 3 kids. So at a certain point I went, my hobby should probably be just, I show up, we do the thing, and then I go. You get a full life with 3 children.
Yeah, that's neat. And I don't want to get too ahead of myself, but it's immediately so clear to me how improv is such a great metaphor, maybe, for the way that we in any part of our lives are creating social worlds. Because if you are doing an improv scene, that's one version of creating a social world. And like you're getting at, part of that construction and the collaboration and the co-creation has to be a kind of yes and mentality that you bring to it.
That's right. And all the concepts, as many of the concepts we know, like emergence, co-creation, like you're mentioning, and others, that really is what it's about. I think it is helpful too, because some people, I've had this reaction before, think that when I say improv or improvisation, it is saying winging it, or, you're just winging it, right? Do we really want our politicians and teachers ever just winging it? No structure, right? And that's actually not what we're after. That there are structures and things that undergird improvisational processes. I love Bernard Short's definition of improv, which is observing, connecting, and responding to other people at a heightened level.
That's great. Yeah.
So those things we normally do, we observe, we connect, we respond. We're doing that with more intentionality. We're doing that with more practice, with repetition, to get better at that, to just make connections between people.
Yeah, that's neat. What I'm immediately hearing in your story is that it's such a great example of what it really means to adopt a communication perspective. Like you said, it's not add communication and stir. You're really trying to make communication the center of all these different areas of your life and kind of bring them together around this perspective. And I think that's a really big focus for me, because all the other, quote unquote communication podcasts that are out there that I've seen are like the language they use is let's teach you these communication skills. And those are so great. But my hope is to be able to go that step further and say, beyond just giving you these skills and just say, this situation pops up, do this. I want to go beyond that and say, how can you have a deeper understanding under those skills that informs how you know how to use those skills to get that? How do you cultivate the communication perspective for people? How can maybe in conversations like the ones in this podcast, can people start to adopt that communication perspective?
I love that. Yeah, I think that's always been a goal, is to switch people into that. And by that, I'm hearing in what you said that a lot of other understandings of communication out there are still grounded, as we know, in the transmission view, which is very limited. And, we exchange information and people think about the send and receive messages. That's transmission understandings of communication. A big thing, I think, I don't think we know fully how to do this yet, but is to move people's understandings of communication into that constitutive view. And I don't think that's just an academic move. And I don't think that's just nice to have. I think it's central to CMM and these types of projects. And here, I think here's the connection, I think, with improv. It's liberating to have a wider view and to see, I think a constitutive view really helps us see more openings and opportunities for change, just with identities, things like that. Even I don't have to be just one thing. I can have multiple parts of myself, right, that are useful. I can play coach, negotiator, problem solver, leader, storyteller, really expanding our understandings of who we are and what we can do through communication, I think is really critical. A lot of this for me too overlaps with adaptive leadership theory, which says that one goal of good leadership is to broaden our bandwidth. That whatever you do, and I ground my improv projects a lot in this, moving beyond our default settings, our typical habits and ways of being and typical ways of responding and interacting with people, which, by the way, are all useful. The reason we have habits is because they've served us well in some circumstances. But I would argue to do democracy well, to do the work of how democracy and politics for me are just, how is it we're all going to live together? That's it, right? Is that basic question. How are we all going to live together? I think one of the ways to do that is to just help people at an individual, group, and organizational level move beyond these defaults to a more constitutive view of communication and realize they have more options than they ever realized.
Yeah. I'm already so excited about all the ideas that you're generating and things that I want to immediately start talking about. But I do want to still be able to frame our conversation with this question of, what is your idea of a better social world? How do you understand it? What does it look like to you? And so before I get too ahead of myself, I want to know, what does Don's better social world look like?
I think having understanding a better social world should probably start with some humility. First of all, that there's always more to know about what a better social world could be. And that's what's exciting about this. There's no 2 + 2 = 4 answer to this question, I think. I think it has to remain open-ended so we can open space for communication with others as much as possible. So I'll just start there.
Yeah.
Worlds where communication is open rather than closed is really key. Where there's transparency, there's accountability, where people are in much more of an open book mode with each other, I think, is really critical. And, you just read the news cycle, what's in the news cycle constantly, and how many problems that surface, the things that are going on in organizations, issues of racial and gender oppression and disparities in institutions, how much of that has to do with lack of open, really authentic, forthright communication between people, right? I think quite a lot. So open communication environments, I think, would be one thing. A second thing, I think there's something, a great social world has some component of joy within it. right? There's an awful lot in the world to get us down, right? And before we get to all the humanly created problems, which are created through communication, right?
Yeah.
That we just went to war, right? Racial issues, all created through communication at their very center. We made those. They didn't just come. We didn't come into the world as babies and all. They were made at some point. But before we get there, we've got to deal with actual things that the world presents to us, which is hurricanes, hurricane out in California this week, infectious diseases. We have enough going on in the world to not have to add any more humanly created problems to the mix. Yet most of the problems we deal with as human beings were created by us, right, through communication. So the great thing about that is that there's an opportunity, I think, to revise them through communication as well, right? If communication got us into our problems, it can also get us out of them, right? Infectious diseases, things like that, they're going to spread rampant. They're going to do their own thing, but our response to those things is important too. There is a communication component. But I think joy, because again, there's just a lot in the world that is there to challenge us. So I go back to that Barnett Pierce, those stories he had in his book about going to the two different grandparents' houses and how those were two different social worlds. And one world was very austere, and in the other world, it was filled with laughter. And I think about that a lot, right? And so for me, it's like a joyful space of some kind. I'm not talking about toxic positivity or anything like that, but one in which joy and majority of the time there's positive communication happening, I think is really key. Other features of these social worlds, I think democratic for me, a sense of this is a we place, not just individuals or special interests operating of their own accord. I think we need silos, we need teams, we need those types of things. But to go with the first thing, is there open space for communication? I think that a good social world has a sense that everyone matters, that we all have different standpoints. We are all operating from different standpoints, and that we need to open space for other standpoints as much as possible, right? I see this happening a lot right now in discussions about organizations, a lot of literature on that stuff. We've inherited this model of organizations that is 150 years old at least. Most of the world, organizations are run in very hierarchical, top-down fashion. That can work really well for some industries like manufacturing, by the way. So I don't think we should just denigrate it, put it off the board. But the issues we've seen through the pandemic, for instance, essential workers, things like that, right? There's manifestos around this kind of thing now, people saying we always deserved a stake in the organization. We always deserved a voice. All of this was always prefaced upon the work that we do on the front line, right? There would be no organization, there would be no finance behind it or revenue generation without some kind of attention to what we do. So I think over and over, we're seeing within organizations across the world, there's just this cry for voice that is a marker of a good social world. Do people feel valued, affirmed? Do they feel like they have voice? That has to be part of things. I think I have about 20 more things to tell you about good social world, but we'll stop at 3 right now.
Hey, that's a great start. And like you said, it's like, I asked the question because it's important to acknowledge that we can't just take for granted that everyone's understanding of what a better social world is, or everyone's definition of better, is the same. And so that's why I ask. And I know that people's answers to that are informed by their experience and what they've witnessed in the world and the way that they conceptualize things. And so I think that's why it's interesting to kind of start the conversation with, tell me a little bit about who you are, and then what's your idea of a better social world? Because even then I can already kind of start piecing things together and start to think about, well, how does using improv help us to get toward that better social world? How does taking this communication perspective help us to get toward the better social world? If, I'm taking your answer and kind of working backwards from there and say, okay, well, how do we actually get there? But what I'm really sticking with from your story is this idea of revision. And I think it's a great way to frame kind of what needs to be done or what we're kind of in the process of, because it is really its own version of asking those 3 CMM-ish questions of like, how do we get here? Or how did this get made? What's going on right now? And then what do we want to be doing in the future? Because if we're revising, we are acknowledging that meaning was made by us. We made choices about the meaning. We can look back, reflect, see the patterns, look at the stories that were told or untold, decide how we feel about that.
Yeah.
Figure out what's going on now. And then, be able to revise and say, okay, those were the choices that were made then. We actually want to make different choices now. And so we're just revising, we're evolving. And like you're getting at, coming up with these new ways of communicating, because it's not a stagnant thing. It's not a simple thing. It's a very complex, rich, layered process. Communication is in our lives and in our social worlds. And so what new choices can we be making around them?
Absolutely. I see this as a lot of efforts around DEI right now have to do with this question of what is a good social world. That's really what they're trying to address. And the good versions of that are really making a difference in creating social changes in organizations, and I think in society of work in DEI. I had a book I came out with a couple of years back called Leadership Standpoints. I had interviewed tons of nonprofit professionals around New York City just to ask them about, it was through this program called at the time, the New York Community Trust Leadership Fellowship, what they saw as the leadership most needed for the era we're in right now. And 3 big areas came up out of this. And when they gave me when I was looking at the themes across interview transcripts and things, I kept thinking this. I was like, they're just telling us what social worlds would manifest the qualities of communication that matter most to them at the end of the day, the patterns of communication that matter most. 3 things came up. One was inclusion, which is just that, any organization and leader not dedicated to inclusion has missed the mark in this day and age, in short and long range strategies. The second was performance. That I love this idea. And this goes back to Lev Vygotsky a little bit for me. He had something called the proximal zone of development, which is the idea that we can build spaces for performance. And performance was the second thing. It was inclusion first, performance second, building spaces for performance. And I've seen a concept like this show up in a lot of different places. In adaptive leadership theory, it's sometimes called the productive zone of disequilibrium. It's a bit of a mouthful. Or holding spaces, like the ability to construct a space, which I think is a social world, that people can perform into in new ways, people saw as really critical to leadership. So I summed it up as building spaces for performance. But that kind of performance could be breaking off the status quo, trying new things. Or some organizations are experimenting with things like dropping job titles in favor of multiple roles and identities. There's all kinds of interesting work going on with this, but I think that's pretty big for a social world. Like, what kind of space are we creating and holding? And those kinds of spaces might be, I've heard this called proto-public. They're not public spaces necessarily. They're spaces for development. They're spaces for growth. And so I think social worlds, good social worlds, also have that in them. Is we're not just going to go public yet. Let's have spaces where we can experiment and play and improvise our ways to, different futures, different ways of doing things. For anybody listening, by the way, there's a terrific tool, Liberating Structures. I don't know if you've come across in the podcast yet. It's a series of 33 methods or tools for holding meetings and things like that, where everybody's included, everybody's engaged, versus typical ways of organizing ourselves at work or meeting. They have a tool in there called improv prototyping that's very much about this. It's like, here's a typical way we might have a feedback session between an employer and an employee. Let's, in groups of 3, improvise new ways of doing that, and organizations come up with better social worlds for the episode of having a feedback session as part of that. And the last thing, just summing up off this project, it was inclusion, performance, and range. Said great leadership in this era needs to be about range and broadness, and just constantly looking at the event, realizing no one person can do all of it. Like, we're going to have to push our peripheral vision out further, so that you're just always looking out there for other voices, material conditions and constraints, power relationships. You're just looking broadly to what's happening and not narrowly. That's really what's needed.
Yeah.
For a good social world from a leadership perspective nowadays.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I know this is not what you mean by broad, but this is the idea it's sparking in me, is that, you mentioned early on about international relations, countries making these big decisions that affect so many people's lives, is really interpersonal communication. These huge organizations that are trying to function, it's really just interpersonal communication. And it's so interesting to look at it from both sides of this super broad perspective of, this is countries speaking and deciding these huge decisions. And then also it's really just two people sitting at a table talking, and it's both at the same time. And how does that help us understand how we actually move through these spaces? And I just think when people talk about communication, or if you're Googling communication, or listening to a lot of other communication podcasts, they're about communication in like an organization. And it's interesting to me that I feel like that's maybe the most public, I guess, to use your word, or the area of communication that has had the most attention recently to have maybe developed a little more, because businesses are like really invested in that. But it's interesting, because I'm sitting here in my undergrad, not right now, but when I was, studying communication, and then my concentration was interpersonal. And then the other option for concentration was organizational or public. And it's like, they're all hand in hand. They all work together. And
yeah, I love that, Abbie. I think you're absolutely right. That's a false division in a way. And that's what I love about communication, studying communication and doing practitioner work in it, is we're never done. These things all go together. And the communication field is really well situated to not be narrow.
Yeah.
And to make those connections for people about what do groups have to do with organizations, have to do with individuals. We can do that. I think one thing I want to add, and here's a question for you I'd love to know a bit about. I've been playing with this recently, and I'm presuming some understanding on behalf of the audience here of some different CMM tools and models. For anyone listening who's not, I'm referring to something called the hierarchical serpentine model. So which at its base means like you've got two individuals talking, and they call it the speech act. We're talking with each other. But above that, there's different levels going on that address the context, that help us analyze when two people are communicating, a lot of what's going on that's not really obvious, but it's happening. And it gives us a tool to analyze this. So I have become really interested recently in using the concept of episode, right? So that two people are talking, and that's not just people talking, that is being framed through their talk, or maybe even before they were talking, it was framed as a particular kind of episode. This is the annual performance evaluation. This is the repetitive derogatory feedback session that happens every year. There's many different ways of framing any situation. And I've been wondering recently, so compared to those other understandings of communication that you're talking about, I never hear episode really referred to in skills training even. And I think that is an incredible tool for incredible skill to cultivate, is to identify what kind of episode are we in, to frame or reframe for people what we're doing. Just to give you an example of this, I've been telling folks in trainings recently, this seems to have been it's had a pretty good reaction, that when you're entering a conversation with someone, you can tell them about the type of conversation that you want to have. You can say, in a political conversation, for instance, right now, it seems that we are in a vociferous debate, right?
Yeah.
That's how I named the episode happening here. I'm really interested in a dialogue where we learn from each other. And one of the norms is that we really listen to each other and be able to understand where we're coming from. Something like that, right?
Yeah.
I want this to be a deliberation that has some kind of outcome to it. You could frame it in many different ways, but that ability to name and just frame or reframe the episode for people, I think it's such a critical skill that it's not advice about public speaking, and it's not writing instructions, which is, good writing techniques, which a lot of people think communication breaks down to. So I don't know. I'm interested to know from you if you see that vocabulary like this is yet to be scaled further, I guess, or what the possibilities might be for using things like episode or similar concepts in addition to the typical skills training work that people receive.
Yeah, because you're saying the skill associated with episodic thinking would be to name the episode.
You said it better than I could.
No, I was just making sure, because there's so many different ways to understand the episode, and it's wild that it is such a novel idea to say, hey, what if you clearly stated your expectations before an interaction? That's what I think about a lot. Is expectations, because I am a person with a lot of expectations, and that kind of became a problem in a number of my relationships, because I expected, whether it was like a work or like interpersonal relationships, because I was like expecting a lot out of people, but not necessarily communicating it well, because I didn't know how to do that. And so I think it kind of came to this point for me of, okay, the current, again, doing some revision, the current situation is not working for me, not working for the people in my life.
Yeah.
I guess I could either just not have expectations, which is not an option for me, at least. It was kind of like, that's
any
one
human being
answer, but it's not an answer. And the other option being, what if I actually just said them out loud? Because I think if you buy into the Enneagram at all, I'm an Enneagram 2. And one of the things that really resonates with me about that is that we're particularly prone to resentment. And so that's why I see that relationship being there. If I don't communicate my expectations, but I have them, then I could get really resentful about people not meeting them. But if I say them out loud and I'm clear about that, then the resentment almost disappears. And not that my expectations always get met, but that opens up, like you're saying, so much space for open communication and authentic communication about my wants, my needs, the needs of the relationship, what the actual social world of the relationship looks like. Simple, but revolutionary, whatever you'd want to say, what if you met people and clearly expressed your expectations, and like you're saying, that set the tone? How could that change? Okay, that is all for part 1 of our conversation with Don. Thank you for joining us, and come back next week for part 2. The next turns I would have you take away after this episode ends to keep the conversation going in your own life is to think about the questions I've posed at the top of the description. They are: what in life can you yes and? How can our understanding and practice of communication evolve to match other advancements we've made as a community? And what does it look like to use improv in our everyday lives, which is not to be confused with winging it? I think these are great reflection questions to be considering in our own lives. I think using improv principles and truly centering communication, like we talked about with Don today, can be really transformative for the way we engage with others in the world. And so that's something I'd like to invite you to reflect on and try on in your own life as well. As always, I'm supported by the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. This podcast is one of many initiatives designed to help us get one step closer to creating those better social worlds that we hope for. And finally, the podcast next turn I'd like to offer you is to share this episode with someone that you think it would be meaningful for, or someone that you want to invite into this conversation. I appreciate you taking the time to do that, as well as following the podcast wherever you listen and leaving ratings and reviews. Thank you for doing that. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for being curious, and thank you for being a part of this story. I'm Abbie, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told.